My name is Pete Filicetti. I'm a principal consultant with Kingsman Technology Solutions. We're a company that predominantly does Office 365 and SharePoint development with an emphasis on SharePoint. I used to work for Microsoft, left about 2 years ago, worked in Microsoft Consulting Services. Kind of went out on our own to focus just on the SharePoint and Office 365 aspect of what we were doing. This is a small group. If there's questions, just stop me. We work through them as we go, especially when we get into the code and the demos. So the objectives, we kind of want to go through an introduction to SharePoint framework development. Little bit frustrating for some folks as we've gone through various iterations of frameworks and libraries with SharePoint development. It seems like we always have something new, but SharePoint framework seems to be the biggest investment. A lot of exciting announcements at Ignite recently that we'll go through in a later slide. We'll go through the current tooling that we have available for doing SharePoint framework development. I'm only going to focus on the Windows side. I know there's a lot of the similar tools for other platforms, but I'm just going to focus on the Windows tooling for this. And the development cycles for offline and online development, both using the SharePoint Workbench locally and in SharePoint Online. The big takeaways are that SharePoint development is moving away from just a pure Windows-based development into industry standard JavaScript, Node, Yeoman, the current cool web development technologies. And to go over the tooling required to build SharePoint customizations, because at least for me it was a big change. I was always kind of a server-side C# type guy. So this was really new to me. So setting up the environments, we'll go through that because it's a little bit challenging. And like I said, if you're working on something other than a Windows platform, it probably a little bit different, but you should be able to figure it out from what we're going to do. So we're going to focus predominantly on the client web parts. Although SharePoint Framework extensions are now in general availability, this session is predominantly around developing client-side web parts. We have 45 minutes, so we can't really do both. We had to pick one, but extensions are a whole other topic that you can go in and do research on and start working with as well, because they're both in general availability. So this is modern client-side development. They're lightweight. It's a little bit synonymous to what you might have been doing if you were taking and injecting direct JavaScript into pages to do things. That's sort of what's happening with this. Microsoft's investing heavily. This is what powers their current experiences. And we'll see that when we do a little bit of a demo on the modern pages with some of the client-side web parts that Microsoft has developed. And this is backward compatible. It's been announced in Feature Pack 2 that you'll be able to develop SharePoint Framework client-side web parts to run on SharePoint 2016 on-premise with Feature Pack 2. And it supports open source tools and JavaScript web frameworks, and we'll go through what all of those are and how they work together. This just gives you a little bit of an idea how you can work with Microsoft Graph or with Lob Systems Cloud Services. There's a lot of different ways to tie all this together to bring really strong content to your SharePoint pages. These are the kind of the high-level components. How many people have worked with the modern pages in SharePoint? Okay, so we'll go through a quick demo of that when we get there to show you what's available in the modern pages. The other thing that we're going to get is JavaScript resource management, and we have access to the page context and site data APIs, meaning access directly to SharePoint lists from these client-side web parts. We also have the ability to do tenant scope deployments, so these will be available throughout the tenant to anybody that wants to install them. For the build process and tooling, again, this was a big change for me, using Yeoman templates and Gulp and Webpack and all of these tools that frankly I had never worked with or heard of. But the documentation has made it pretty good so that if you're not familiar with it, the ramp up isn't super difficult. And SharePoint Workbench, which again is available locally with the projects that you have and in SharePoint Online, and it gives you the ability to work with and test with your client-side web parts. So it's nice on a plane ride here, I could work with the local stuff on here and not worried about being connected to SharePoint Online to have to test. This is a slide I just threw together really quickly based on what was announced at Ignite recently. So in general availability, tenant-wide deployment for SharePoint Framework client-side web parts and for extensions. Like I said, Feature Pack 2 gives us on-premise classic page deployment. So our new web parts that we build with SharePoint Framework will work on classic pages, not just on modern pages with Feature Pack 2. The new version of Yeoman Generator, the 1.3 version, and actually I think it's 1.31 is out now, and that's what we use for scaffolding and building up these SharePoint Framework projects. And SharePoint Framework extensions to give us custom fields, headers, and footers. And again, we're not going to dive into that in this session. There's just not enough time, but there's some resources at the end of the slide deck that you can go out and go to GitHub and look at the examples that Microsoft has put together, as well as the patterns and practices team. A lot of the concepts for how we build and run the client-side web parts, you'll be able to apply to the extensions as well. So for the future, and by future, Microsoft is targeting to get all of this done by the end of 2017, which is a little bit adventurous, I would say, but we'll see if it happens. They've been moving at a really incredible pace. The cadence on this has been very fast. So application lifecycle management APIs for SharePoint Framework solutions, kind of bringing the whole DevOps thing together. A site collection app catalog instead of a tenant-wide app catalog. Asset packaging for your JavaScript, CSS, image files. Support for the Office UI Fabric core styles. We'll touch on that a little bit as we get further into this. That's what gives your client-side web parts a look and feel like they actually are part of SharePoint or part of the Office ecosystem. And then the configuration of web APIs and permission scopes, particularly related to Microsoft Graph. And I promise I'm not going to kill you with slides. We'll spend a fair time in some of the demos as well. So, has anybody used the client-side web parts? There were only a couple people that worked with modern pages, so probably not many have worked with the client-side web parts that Microsoft has developed. Okay. So they're pretty much the same as the web parts that you're used to working with. It's just how they're built and deployed is quite a bit different. There are some subtle nuances that I'll show you when we go through the demo of how they actually work as far as settings and things like that. But again, they're built for the modern JavaScript-driven world. So a lot of the things that we used to develop with server-side code and C#, we know that in SharePoint Online, there's no full trust solutions. Sandbox solutions are now deprecated. We're really getting pushed out into where everything needs to be developed in the client scope, not on the servers anymore. And they run directly inside a SharePoint page because really it's just JavaScript that's being injected into the page. All right, so let's jump out of here and look at some modern pages. So this is, and there's something weird with the resolution. I'm sorry about the text on this, but you'll get the idea of what we're looking at. This is a modern page. When you create it, it's kind of a blank canvas. So if I jump in to edit this, so I have this little plus here now. That's where it says add a new section or web part. So I'm going to click that. And the last time I did a presentation on this, there weren't near as many there. And again, this is clear on my laptop. I don't know why that's doing that. But it says text, image, file viewer, link. You can put in section layouts. Those were there. You can stick in Bing Maps or a group calendar. So I'll just take and put in a text one. And over here, you can just start typing your text in. There's a little trash can up there for the delete, which is sort of similar to what we had for web parts before. Actually, let me put another one in for an image. So that was huge. The interesting thing is the pencil for edit web part. now when you change your settings on these new modern client-side web parts, you notice there's no save or cancel here. When you do it, it's done. So I just type that in. I don't hit save. If I just close this, and now when I do save and close, since that was the alt text, it's going to make a liar out of me. Anyway, the alt text should show up there. It did save it, because if I go back in to edit on the web part, it has it in there. So it's an automatic save on properties now with web parts. You can turn that off so that it, but by default, that's the way your properties are going to work on client-side web parts now. Does that all make sense? Any questions with the modern web pages? They're just a little bit fancier looking. You can remove all of the little swirls and things up there, but it just gives you a slightly different canvas to work on for inserting the web parts on there. So this is where we get to the fun stuff. How many people have worked with tools like this? Okay, great. So this isn't as new to you as it was to me then. Predominantly, your tools that you're going to use to build both the client-side web parts and extensions, you're going to start with an installation of Node and use npm to install Gulp and Yeoman. Your client-side web parts are built with TypeScript. We keep putting this on the slides, but Angular is not supported out of the box yet. You can do your own custom, but as far as scaffolding an actual client-side web part, Angular is not one of the choices yet. We keep hearing it's coming, but it's not there yet. And as far as code editors, I'm a Visual Studio Code guy, but Atom, Sublime, whatever you want to use for text editing. The nice thing with code is it kind of does a great job of showing the whole project structure. I like pretty colors. It has nice icons for the specific file types that you're working through. So you'll see that when we bring up Visual Studio Code. But completely up to you what you want to use to edit it. You can use Visual Studio proper, the big editor if you want. So this is kind of our comparisons between what we had and what we have now. So IIS and Microsoft.NET are now Node.js, so we'll be using a lot of the tools within NPM. NPM's kind of our replacement for NuGet for pulling down all the packages. And I'll show you one of the complaints that I have with this is the size of the project to pull down when we create this project. I'll show you how big that is. Gulp is our MS Build replacement. TypeScript is our replacement for C#. Not a huge jump, at least for me, to TypeScript. I mean, it feels a lot like writing C#. It makes it a lot nicer than writing JavaScript anyway. And Yeoman for scaffolding replaces our Visual Studio project templates. It just gives us a starting point to work through with this. I haven't done a lot of investment in how to pare this down, but you'll see the disk size footprint that this has. There's been a lot of development in Office UI Fabric, and this continues to push, and that was one of the future things that Microsoft has committed to is support for this. Essentially, this is just what's going to give our client-side web parts the look and feel that they belong in SharePoint or, like I said, in the Office ecosystem. We're not going to do anything with a demo on this, but it is available, and it's supposed to GA later this year. So for a tool installation, I use cmder as a command prompt. You don't have to. You can use whatever your favorite, like what comes with the OS, or if you install something else. Your editor, Node.js, that's just a standard download for your Windows machines. When you need to update it, you can just install the latest version. It just does an update for you. And then using npm to install the parts that you'll need to build your actual project. So you're going to install Yeoman, Gulp, and then the SharePoint scaffolding has the little bit longer name there. Those are all global installations. That's a -G on there. That'll give you the core tooling that you need to build your client-side web parts and your extensions in SharePoint Framework. So let's look a little bit at the parts that you have. And I probably need to update this slide because you'll see at the top I'm importing that from SP Client Preview. That's no longer where this is. We're out of Preview and into GA, so I probably should have updated that picture. But essentially this base client-side web part, that's going to be our base for everything that we do in a web part. And that's going to give us our access to the DOM and to the context. It's where we tie in with the property pane, so the settings for our web parts. And when we go into demo, I'll show you how we can add additional properties and how those all tie in together with your web parts. But that's going to kind of be your core. You don't really need to know that much about it except that it's the base, and you'll see the things like your render. That's going to be your entry point for your client-side web parts. The manifest is going to be very similar to what you're used to if you've built web parts in Visual Studio with going through and setting the values for your web part in elements.xml. The group, we're just providing a value, the title, description, and then you have a few other things that are specific to this, like Office Fabric icon font name. And then you can add in your additional properties here. You see where this one just has description. You can also provide default values by providing the default key with the text that goes with it. And then you have some versioning, some basic values that get set. And we'll look at these when we build a demo project to go through and customize and tweak around with. And SharePoint Workbench. So when we take and create a new project and run it using Gulp, it's automatically going to launch your web part. It's going to launch the SharePoint Workbench so that we can go through and test and debug and work with the web part itself. And if you've worked with Node and with Gulp, the nice thing is, as we're working with this, if we go back to our editor and make changes to the code and save it, it automatically recompiles, redeploys, and it shows you real-time the change in your local workbench. If you're working with the workbench in SharePoint Online, you do have to refresh to see those changes, but when it's local, it's able to tell and reload it automatically. Like I said, this is we'll look at it in SharePoint Online as well. The implementations are exactly the same, except for the fact that you have to manually add your web part for the SharePoint Online. I'll apologize. This slide seemed like a good idea at the time going through all these steps, but I'm going to hit these very quickly. So this is the flow if you're building your client-side web parts, is you're going to start with the install, and that's a one-time thing to install the scaffolding, the SharePoint generator. And then you're going to use Yeoman, and we'll do this to create our project by doing yo at Microsoft/SharePoint. Then you'll go through and do your coding with whatever editor you want to do on that. When you run gulp serve, that's where you test it locally in your SharePoint Workbench in the local instance. You can go right to the online if you want. You can test it either way. You hit your decision point, are we ready to ship? And probably there's a few more iterations there before you're going to ship everything. And then you're going to package your solution using Gulp. And you can use Gulp to deploy to Azure storage. And then you can do a manual upload of the app to your app catalog. And it'll be available on Classic and client-side page, or I'm sorry, Classic and the new modern Canvas pages. So these are some of the commands that you'll want to kind of use as a cheat sheet for what you're going to be doing. A lot of them are based around Gulp, but that top one there, the yo at Microsoft SharePoint, That's how we're going to scaffold our initial project, and we're going to do that in a demo up here so you can see what that looks like. By default, this is going to need a developer certificate. So if you do gulp trust dev cert, that's going to create a developer certificate, install it in the cert store, and then ask you if you trust it. And then moving forward, you'll have a trusted certificate for dev so that when you launch this in Chrome or whatever, it doesn't tell you that the certificate's invalid. For building and bundling your project, that's going to be gulp bundle. I like that a lot of the commands actually make sense in what they're called. Gulp serve is what we're going to use to launch the browser workbench, and it's going to be a web server that's listening on port 4200. Packaging your solution, again, is going to build your SPFx file for manual upload. Gulp nuke is sort of like a clean from Visual Studio. And then gulp test runs the tests, and we'll look at those as well. You get a set, it shows you with a single test in there how to build tests so that you can have unit tests built around your web part. And then -- ship is to create a release build. And one of the things that are important when you're building these web parts, because you can run it in so many different ways, is to evaluate what the environment type is. Are we running this in the context of a unit test? Are we running it in the local SharePoint Workbench, in which case we want to mock data? Are we running on SharePoint in Office 365? Then we might want to use real data. So we kind of have some decision points based on the environment that we're running in. This changed recently. It used to be that this was in the context. Now they've kind of shifted where it's at, and we're going to stick some code into the demo web part that we're using to evaluate where we're at so that we can take the appropriate actions. This isn't a complete list, but these are some of the property pane values, the settings for your web part that you can use. When you create a demo project, by default, you get that text field, and they call it, I think it's called description. But these are all of the other ones you can use, and there are more. And this is simply done by adding to the import statement to import where those are, and I'll show you how to add that to the collection of property pane attributes that we have so that those show up. So let's jump out of here and create a demo. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to make a directory, and we'll call it demo2. So we're doing yo at Microsoft SharePoint. And that's going to scaffold our project. So the first thing it's going to do is come up, and I swear I thought I'd never see ASCII art again. I can't believe that that's something that even exists still. But it's back. So it's going to ask you, what's your solution name? By default, it's going to derive something by the directory you're creating this in. You can change it, or you can just hit enter to keep that. So we're going to hit enter. Then you have your choices here, SharePoint Online only, or SharePoint 26 onward, including SharePoint Online. So this is what we were talking about with Feature Pack 2 for on-prem 2016 installation. So we can target that as well. But we're going to work with SharePoint Online with this, so I'm just going to hit enter. Your blue highlighted one is the default selection. Do we want to use the current folder or create a subfolder? I'm going to use the current folder since I created that just for this demo. And now this is the new one with the tenant deployments. And it's a long question, but essentially, do you want to allow the tenant admin to be able to deploy this tenant-wide for everyone to use in your tenant? So we'll say yes. And now this is the relatively new part. we've been always building web parts from the preview up until a little while ago. Now you can build extensions. We're going to stick with a web part for this demonstration, but this is where you would have sort of that fork in the road between building a web part and an extension. We'll stick with the default on this demo of Hello World for the name of the web part. It gives you a default description. And these are your framework choices. Do you want no JavaScript framework? Do you want React, or do you want Knockout? And depending on what you're doing, you can pick one of those. And like I said, there's a lot of effort going into people making Angular work with what they're doing, but it's not one of the default scaffolding choices yet. And now it's kind of off to the races. And this is, like I said, one of the complaints. We have a pretty good internet connection for the speaker network, but this is going to pull down about 250 megabytes of files. I mean, it's fairly immense. So the thing that you kind of start thinking about is, if I'm working on 15, 16 different web parts, and each of them have all of their own copies of these files that have been pulled down, it adds up pretty quickly. So we'll give that another minute and that'll finish up. But let me launch Explorer and go over and I'll show you the size. So this demo folder is one that I had pulled down previously, but just to give you an idea. $259 megabytes, 32,450 files in 4,857 folders. I admit we got spoiled with Visual Studio and everything it did for us and how nice and tight they were. And depending on your stance, are we, going back to doing everything in command prompts and generating things with this many files? Are we moving ahead? I don't really know the answer to that. Just something to think about, I guess. All right. And it's going to tell us, with a little bit more ASCII art for the SharePoint logo, that it has created our Demo 2 project. So now, just like with a lot of the default Visual Studio projects where you can hit Control F5 and launch it, we can just come through and do gulp serve. And it's going to do some more work. It's going to launch the browser. Now, I don't know how well you can see, but you can see up there, port 4321, it's launched a Workbench. And that's actually launching it. There's a copy of the Workbench that goes in with every project that you scaffold. That's actually where that's coming from. So now we can come up here, and we have the same plus sign that we had on the modern pages. And there's our Hello World web part that is being served up now when we typed gulp serve. So we can click that, add that. This is our web part. And like I was saying, the properties, so if we hit edit web part, we can see here's a description field. And it's Hello World, which matches up to the text just above the button there. So if you see, as I'm typing into there, it's automatically updating the web part. It's live. There's no save on that. It's just done. And then we can hit OK, and that's our web part. We can delete from here. We can add multiple instances of it and test from the actual page. One of the things that is nice, and I should have done this before I did gulp serve, so let me cancel this. So I'm going to launch Visual Studio Code. And this is, there are a lot of files there. There are a lot of the node modules. We're not going to go into those. The bulk of what we're interested in is underneath this source, and it's going to list out the web parts. As you can tell by that folder, you could have multiple web parts in a project. This one, the bulk of what we have. Can everybody read that text? Is that big enough? Okay. So this is the web part manifest, and this is what we saw on the slide earlier that gives us the name of the web part, some of the other things, the description of it, the title. A lot of these are common properties that existed on web parts before. This JSON file, though, is where you update those now. You'll also see that attribute requires custom script. If that's set to true, it won't allow this web part to be installed on pages that don't, or sites that don't allow custom script. And there's a link in there about that. This is the makings of your CSS file. So there's a lot of, you'll see the actual content that gets put into this. Default project uses all of these styles. But this is going to get compiled out into your CSS for the project. And this is the core. This is the part that derives from your base client-side web part. The project gives you a little bit more than we showed in that slide. This probably isn't how you would want to do it if you're building production web parts, but they jam the HTML right into the render. So all it's doing is setting that inner HTML value to the content there. You would probably want to put it somewhere else, especially if you're building web parts that you need to localize for various parts of the world. And it's interesting because that's actually built into the project by default. It's just not leveraged here. And what I mean by that is if you look at, there's a localization folder here. And it gives you 2 files by default. So my strings is going to define an interface. Those 3 strings on that interface are going to be used throughout the project, and that's where you would add new strings. If any of you are old like I am and worked with MFC and you had the old string tables where you could put into different languages, this is similar, where you're defining what strings are used throughout the project, and then a separate file based on language implements what those strings are for that interface. Does that make sense? So it gives you by default an English version. So those same things, for example, property pane description, it puts those values in there. So if you had all the different languages that you were going to support with your web part, you just implement those over here. Instead of English US, you would have the various languages that you wanted to support. So I'm going to jump back over here real quick and do gulp serve again. And I'm going to add the web part again. So you'll see if we jump back into Visual Studio Code and come down into here, and it says welcome to SharePoint. Now as soon as I save this, if you watch down here, this cmder, you're going to see it should turn green. It must have happened. So what it did was it rebuilt and repackaged. So now if we jump back over to the browser, you'll see it just automatically updated the text that we typed in there. So any changes that we make on the fly, as soon as we save it, those are rebuilt and reshown here. Am I keeping everybody awake? Are we good? Yes? So this isn't using IIS at all. So when you install Node and you run gulp serve, that's the web server for you. Yeah, we've kind of, it's an interesting thing. I could be running this on a MacBook. A lot of the same tools apply between Windows or Linux or on an Apple device as well. So yeah, there's nothing that's Microsoft specific any longer. And if you look, the extension on the workbench is .html. It's just standard HTML that this is being run in. It continues to be something that Microsoft is pushing forward to, is having a bigger developer audience, I guess, by bringing all these things together. And I was laughing because every time I present on something related to Microsoft, I'm using a lighter and lighter and less powerful piece of equipment. I've done presentations and done development on this using a Surface Pro. I mean, you don't need, I carry around a 12-pound Lenovo W540 for other work I do that's, you know, all the old type SharePoint development, but this stuff, I mean, you can do it on some really lightweight equipment. Again, as long as you have the disk space for, for the web parts. The other thing that we can do, so we have our web part here and we have the properties. So right now we have a description field and it has a default value. So let's add another, I'll show you where we can add more of those. So down here, this is the property pane definition. So it's going to have a group, so you can create multiple groups, and then within the groups you can have fields. So you could have like specific thing, you could have multiple groups and then the fields within each one and break them apart. You can put horizontal rules in. You can get really advanced with how these lay out. We're just going to throw a property pane toggle in there real quick just to show that we can do that. And to save the typing. So up here you can see that we're importing the property pane text field. So let's import the property pane toggle. And then come down here and we'll make a copy of this. And we'll change this to property pane. You see we're getting IntelliSense autocomplete. We don't really have a field called description 2, but I'm just going to change that to that. And for the label, we should be using that interface for the strings, but I'm just going to hard code this in here. So I'm going to save that. So everything is saved. Now when I come back over here and hit properties, I now have a property pane toggle just by adding that. And we would have to add a field to hold that. Right now I called it description 2, but we could add a Boolean to hold whether we have that property pane toggle on or off. And again, like I showed you on the slide, all those other property pane attributes we can add, so you can do everything you can do in a standard web part. So the next thing I want to do is we're running, I guess we got about 7 minutes left. So this is running locally in the workbench, and I'm served up right now using gulp serve off of port 4200. The SharePoint Online workbench knows that localhost 4200 should be hosting something. So if I go to a browser and go to the workbench, it's going to load up this client-side web part that we're hosting here and make it available to test in SharePoint Online. So if I come out here and I have a link for the workbench. And all this is this is in your Office 365 tenant. It's just _layouts15 workbench.aspx. This should be generally available in any Office 365 tenant at this point. It's been in mine for quite a while, and this is not a developer tenant. This is just a standard tenant. So now I can go through and hit the plus, and down here in other, there's Hello World, and that's my web part that's being run locally through gulp serve on my machine, being surfaced in SharePoint Online through the workbench. So now I can do my testing there as well. And now one of the things that I have a little quick snippet so you don't have to watch me type. Where did I put that? So to demonstrate how the various environments would react to where they're being run, we're going to go into the SP core library, and we're going to import environment and environment type. And then down here in the render, I'm going to add this code that essentially said, if I'm running local, now you see where it's saved and it popped up and it said I'm running local in the workbench because it knows that's the environment type that I'm in. And if I come over here and refresh this page, that's going to pop up and say I'm in SharePoint. So it knows the difference between where it's being run just by using that environment. So it's an enumeration that you can look at if you're running local tests, etc. So I'm going to stop this from running here. And I'm going to run gulp test. And that's going to, you get one test built in by default that passes. So it's going through and running the test now. And you'll see that one test was completed. It's green. And at the top it says should do something. That is from here in test. This is what it gives you by default. So it should do something. Assert OK is true. So if we change that to false and do the same thing, you'll come through and you'll get a lot of red text and it'll tell you it failed. So that's where you can build out a whole bunch of unit tests. You can add all of those in there, and then when you run gulp test, you can make sure all of your unit tests still pass. So just because we're moving into, you know, a JavaScript client-side way of doing things doesn't mean that we don't want to still test code and have an automated way of doing it. So that's one of the advantages there. So we have 3 minutes left. I'm going to try and burn through the remaining slides. You'll be able to download all the slide decks from the TechDays website. So like some of the links in here that I reference, you'll be able to get those later. So again, this is the workflow with building, generating that -- ship for your bundling and packaging your solution, and then deploying to Azure storage. Working with your tenant admin to make it available throughout the tenant to all of the site collections. So that shows you that all of the site admins can install that. And these are some of the learning topics. This helped me when this first started coming out with Node.js. Apparently, there are better ways with managing specific versions, like that there's a manager for NPM for managing the different versions of installations you have. Working with Webpack, there's a lot of different JavaScript frameworks. I don't know how to keep up with all of them, frankly. It seems like there's a new one that comes out every week. But with Angular and React, I think you're pretty safe with making an investment there if you're doing SharePoint framework development. And then the Office Fabric UI, there's a lot of work being done there. If you watch any of the stuff that Andrew Connell does, he does a lot of work in that area as well. And just some of the resources, the blog that I mentioned there, I found there's been a lot of great content there, so if you go out and check that out, he continues to publish a lot of things that are sort of on the leading edge, puts a lot of time into it. And then the Microsoft Patterns and Practices team has a lot of content that they build out. Unfortunately, some of the stuff has fallen behind because things keep changing in the framework, but a lot of their samples are really good. Some of them actually don't run because everything is changing fairly quickly. And then the SharePoint team itself is putting out a lot of content on that GitHub/SharePoint site. So again, we went through a brief introduction of development and deployment. We didn't actually push anything into Azure and then deploy it, but that's all pretty straightforward once you've built and tested your individual web parts and extensions. We talked about the tooling. There are some great in-depth pages if you start with some of the links that I just had about how to set up your development environments if you haven't done this before with Node and with NPM. And then we talked about offline and online development scenarios. And the takeaway, again, we're using modern tools, JavaScript, Node, Gulp, Yeoman, and we looked at some of that tooling that we needed to build the SharePoint customizations. So I think we hit everything on this page. Any questions? I guess this is just rough time. There's more people that have shown up for the next session than we had in my session. Well, thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it.